So good afternoon. Here is the need to knows for today's class. So this is actually a class where we get a chance to review quite a few of the things that we've done before. And we're also going to probably throw in one brand new idea which gets us set up for tomorrow's class a little bit. So please make sure you know all of the meanings of the bold print words from topic 2.1. We're going to review those today just to make sure. Make sure that you can provide examples of food webs and food chains and know how to draw them. Then the new topic for today is this whole idea of thermodynamics. So you'll need to know the two laws of thermodynamics, what they are, and how they applied to food webs and food chains. So I didn't write those out again. I just shortened, just put the initials for those two words down. And then the last thing you should know is what is a keystone species? And we're going to use the RGS as an example of that, and that just simply stands for the Richardson's ground squirrel, which, of course, everyone knows is the official squirrel of Alberta, also known as the ground squirrel. Gopher. The gopher. So in front of you, you have the answers for questions 1 through 9 and 12 on pages 18 and 19. This was homework from a while back. So there's 9, and there's the answer to question number 12. Okay. So in front of you, you have kind of the answer key to the Line Master 2.1a. And there's a couple of real key things to kind of make a note of. First of all, how many of you are clear on what a trophic level is? If you aren't, a trophic level simply is a feeding level, or you can also think of it as how many levels from the sun that particular organism is. So that actually works quite well too in determining the trophic levels. So one other thing that you will often see is that we don't call things typically the third trophic level. The number 3 actually gets another word, and it's this word. Tertiary. And so when you see that word tertiary, you simply know that that's considered to be the third trophic level. So here we can think of the tree as the first trophic level. It's a producer, meaning that it gets its energy from the sun to make its own food. It's also an autotroph. These two words kind of can be used interchangeably. Auto means can make their own, so like an automatic car changes its own gears. And so we've got something here that makes its own food. This deer can be thought of as a primary consumer, which means that it eats plants. That's the only thing that a primary consumer will ever eat is plants. That makes it always a herbivore. It's in the second trophic level, and it's a heterotroph, which means that it can't make its own food. It has to get its food from something else. The wolf is a carnivore, which means it's just a meat eater. It's the secondary consumer. It's also a heterotroph, and it's in the third trophic level. And then the decomposers are heterotrophs because they can't make their own food either. But they don't fit into any of these trophic levels specifically. So here's the Line Master 2.1d, and again, you had to do a couple of things. So the first thing you had to do is draw a food chain. So I just used my red arrows to represent a food chain, and I said that my food chain went from the plant and then the grasshopper ate the plant, or maybe it's some barley, they like grain, and then the frog ate the grasshopper and the snake ate the frog, and that's kind of where it stopped. And just remember, when you're drawing your food chains, the arrows always point in the direction of energy flow. So we always draw an arrow from the grass to the grasshopper, to the frog, to the snake. So that was my food chain. And then in number 2, it says, draw an example of a food web. So now you start to connect all of these things together, and that's what the blue arrows tried to show. Now you have to know something about these animals in order to actually get a food web exactly right. You have to know what they eat, what different things eat. So I kind of thought, well, a grasshopper will eat some grain, and then the bird might eat the grasshopper, and then the little bird might be eaten by the owl. The gopher might be eaten by the owl. The gopher might be eaten by the coyote. The frog might be eaten by the owl, and so on. You just start making all of these connections between all of these different organisms, and then you've got yourself a food web. And then the last thing you had to do, again, you kind of have to know these animals a bit, but are they carnivores or omnivores or herbivores? Producers, so I put the producers are the 2 plants. The grasshopper is definitely a herbivore. The mouse is a herbivore. The gopher is a herbivore. This bird could be an omnivore if it actually eats the grasshopper. An omnivore is something that eats both plants and animals. Okay, so that might be considered an omnivore. We've got some carnivores there, and then you have your sheet properly labeled. So in the diagram I show you in a minute, I would like you to try and identify these things. How many trophic levels are there in the diagram I'm going to show you? What are the autotrophs in the diagram? What are the primary consumers? What are the secondary consumers? Is there anything that's considered tertiary here, which means 3? And is this a food web or a food chain? So in front of you, you have the diagram that you're now going to try and use to answer those questions. So the first question was, what are the autotrophs? Or, oh, sorry, how many trophic levels? So how many trophic levels do you see? 3. Good. If you put 3, that's correct. A lot of people will put 4 because they will simply go 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, isn't that 4 levels? But in this case, the way it's drawn, actually only it has 3, even though it kind of looks like 4. You have to really pay attention to the arrows. Second question was, what are the autotrophs? And of course, autotrophs are plants. So our plants are our autotrophs. So right down here at the first trophic level, those are our autotrophs. What are our primary consumers? Everything in the second trophic level. Every one of those eats plants. Remember, primary consumers are always herbivores or omnivores if they're eating plants in this case. Okay, so that's the third question you had to answer. How many secondary consumers? Just one. It's the wolf, and it's in the third trophic level. And then the next question was, is there anything that you could use the word tertiary to describe? Yeah. Where do you see third? Yeah. So we could call the wolf, we could say the wolf is in the tertiary level, trophic level. Okay, because it's in the third level. So just remember the word tertiary is sometimes interchangeable with the word 3.
So if there's no wolf there, would it be?
No. Then there's nothing tertiary here. And then the last question is that a food web or a food chain? And it's obviously a food web. So this whole notion of a keystone species might actually make some sense if we talk about architecture for a minute. So let me just draw an arch. Who were kind of the first zone people to build with arches? Do you know?
The Aztecs.
Close. The Romans. Okay, so if you look at Roman architecture, that's kind of the first time you'll see these arches. And basically what they did is they used probably a poor bonding mortar, and they started to stack their rocks on kind of angles and started to build their arches that way. But of course you can start to see that as these arches really start to lean from the two sides, they're probably going to fall over until they slid into the very top here. They slid in the keystone. They slid in the keystone, and it's the keystone of that arch that holds that whole arch together. And that's where this idea of the keystone species comes.
They're really important.
Right. Gophers are, in this prairie web, the key species. There are so many other species that depend on them. So I think when God was making these species and helping to create this web, very thoughtful process went, okay, I'm going to have all these species there, and they're going to need to have something to eat. I'm going to build the species that is going to provide a lot of these organisms with their food, and I'm going to build them in such a way that they'll be a reliable food source, and they become a keystone species. So that's something to kind of think about.